On a frozen morning in 1890, hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children gathered at Wounded Knee Creek, believing they were being escorted to safety. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by soldiers, rifles, and cannons aimed from the hills above. Then a single shot shattered the silence and unleashed a storm of violence that would echo through American history. This is the story of Wounded Knee, a tragedy born from fear, broken promises, and a final desperate struggle for survival.
In the closing years of the 1800s, on the vast, wind-scoured plains of what is now South Dakota, a people stood at the edge of everything they had ever known. The Lakota, a people often referred to historically as the Sioux, once masters of a territory stretching farther than the eye could measure, had watched their world shrink year after year, treaty after broken treaty, until it fit inside the fences of a reservation. It had not always been this way. For generations beyond counting, the Lakota had followed the great herds of buffalo across an open and endless country. Their lives moved with the seasons, their spirit tied to land that seemed as permanent as the sky above it. But by the time the 1880s gave way to the final decade of the century, that world was almost gone. The buffalo, once numbering in the tens of millions, had been hunted to near extinction. The land itself, promised to the Lakota by solemn agreement, had been carved away piece by piece, first by settlers, then by railroads, and finally by the United States government itself, which redrew the borders of the Great Sioux Reservation again and again, each time leaving less. By the year 1890, the Lakota people were living through a winter of the soul. Rations promised by the government arrived late, or not at all, or in quantities too small to feed the families waiting for them. Sickness spread through crowded camps. Children went hungry, and an entire nation of proud, self-sufficient people found themselves dependent on the goodwill of a government that had shown, time and again, how little that goodwill could be trusted. It was into this darkness that a new hope arrived, carried on the wind from the deserts of Nevada. His name was Wovoka, a Paiute man who claimed to have experienced a powerful vision during a solar eclipse. In this vision, he said, he had glimpsed a coming resurrection. The buffalo would return in numbers beyond counting. The ancestors who had died would walk again among the living, and the white settlers, along with the suffering they had brought, would vanish from the land like morning frost beneath a rising sun. The path to this new world, Wovoka taught, was a ceremonial dance. Performed in a circle for hours at a time, often until the dancers collapsed from exhaustion or fell into trance like visions, the ritual became known as the ghost dance. The message spread with astonishing speed. Runners and travelers carried word of Wovoka's prophecy across hundreds of miles, from tribe to tribe, until nations who had rarely spoken the same language found themselves united by the same fragile hope. Among the Lakota, the ghost dance took root with particular intensity. Here was a promise that made sense of their suffering, a vision that offered not just comfort, but restoration. The old world, taken from them piece by piece, might yet be given back. Lakota dancers added their own meaning to the ritual, weaving in ghost shirts, garments believed by some to protect the wearer from the bullets of U.S. soldiers and settlers. Whole communities gathered at dusk and danced through the night, drawing strength from a promise that felt, for the first time in years, like something to hold on to. But what brought hope to one people brought fear to another, to the settlers living near the reservations, and to the soldiers and officials sent to keep watch over them. The ghost dance looked nothing like a religious ceremony. It looked like the beginning of an uprising. Newspapers ran alarming headlines. Local agents sent frantic telegrams to Washington, describing dances that numbered in the hundreds and warning of an uncontrollable native population on the verge of war. Few of these observers understood or cared to understand the spiritual nature of what they were witnessing. What they saw instead was a threat, and threats, in the language of the American frontier, were answered with soldiers. By the final weeks of 1890, thousands of United States troops had been dispatched to reservations across the region, ready to suppress a rebellion that existed, in truth, mostly in the fearful imagination of those who ordered them there. Among the Lakota leaders watched most closely by these forces was a man whose name still echoes through American history, a warrior, a holy man, a symbol of resistance that the government had never quite managed to silence. His name was Sitting Bull, and in the bitter cold of mid-December, the fear surrounding him would ignite a chain of events that no one, not the soldiers, not the officials, and certainly not the Lakota families praying for a better world, could stop. By December of 1890, Sitting Bull was living at the Standing Rock Agency, far from the battlefields where he had once led his people against the United States Army. He was no longer young. His body carried the weight of decades of struggle, and his role among the Lakota had shifted from warrior to elder statesman, a living reminder of a freedom that had once seemed unbreakable. But to the agents overseeing Standing Rock, Sitting Bull remained a danger. He had not personally joined the ghost dance, yet he permitted it to be practiced near his home. And his mere presence lent the movement a legitimacy that officials found intolerable. Rumors reached the agency that Sitting Bull intended to leave the reservation entirely, perhaps to join Spotted Elk's band further south. To the men in charge, this was unacceptable. An order was given. Sitting Bull would be arrested. Before dawn on the morning of December 15, 1890, 40 Lakota men serving as Indian police approached Sitting Bull's cabin. These were not soldiers from outside the reservation, but members of his own nation, tasked with carrying out an order that many of them found deeply uncomfortable. Sitting Bull was roused from sleep and told he was being taken into custody. At first, accounts suggest he agreed to go peacefully, but as he was led from his home, a crowd of supporters gathered outside, alarmed and angry at what they were witnessing. The tension in the air grew thick enough to touch. Sitting Bull, sensing the mood of his people, seemed to hesitate, and in the confusion, he called out, urging those nearby not to let him be taken. What happened in the next few seconds would change the course of American history. A Lakota man named Catch the Bear, enraged by the sight of his leader being seized, raised his rifle and fired, striking Lieutenant Bullhead. Bullhead then fired at Sitting Bull, and another officer, Red Tomahawk, also shot him. In the chaos that followed, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. When the smoke cleared and the shouting died down, Sitting Bull lay dead on the frozen ground outside his own home, killed in the very struggle meant to protect him from arrest. The exact sequence of the final shots remains disputed, but the result was unmistakable. One of the most important Lakota leaders was dead. News of his death spread through the Lakota communities like a wound reopening. For many, it confirmed their deepest fears, that no one, no matter how respected, no matter how peaceful their intentions, was safe from the reach of a government determined to control them completely. Among those who felt this fear most sharply was a chief named Spotted Elk, sometimes remembered by the name Bigfoot, who led a band of Miniconjou Lakota camped along the Cheyenne River. Spotted Elk had, at times, supported the ghost dance movement, though his greater concern in these final weeks of December was survival itself, not prophecy. He was an aging man, already suffering from pneumonia, his lungs struggling in the bitter plains winter. Yet, when word reached him of Sitting Bull's death, he understood immediately that his own people might be next on the list of those considered dangerous. Fearing that his band would be blamed for unrest they had no part in, and hoping to find safety among relatives and respected leaders at the Pine Ridge Reservation, Spotted Elk made the decision to move his people south. It was a journey undertaken not in strength, but in desperation. An old and ailing leader guiding several hundred men, women, and children across a frozen, unforgiving landscape, hoping only to reach a place where they might be left alone. Along the way, the band was joined by approximately 38 Hunkpapa Lakota, refugees themselves from the turmoil at Standing Rock following Sitting Bull's death. Together, they pressed onward through the snow, the temperature dropping well below freezing each night, the wind cutting across the open plains with nothing to slow it down. Spotted Elk, too ill to ride upright for much of the journey, was carried in a wagon, wrapped against a cold that seemed determined to finish what politics had started. Word of their movement reached the United States Army almost immediately. To military commanders already on edge, a band of Lakota traveling without permission, so soon after the death of Sitting Bull, looked like exactly the uprising they had been dreading. Troops were dispatched to intercept them, not to escort them safely to their destination, but to stop them, disarm them, and bring them under control. On December 28, 1890, near a place called Porcupine Butte, a detachment of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, under the command of Major Samuel Whitside, caught up with Spotted Elk's exhausted band. There would be no reaching Pine Ridge unescorted. There would be no quiet resolution. If you're finding this story as powerful as we did researching it, take a moment to hit like. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. There's much more to this story ahead. The soldiers ordered the band to make camp at a nearby creek, a place whose name would soon become inseparable from tragedy: Wounded Knee Creek. The band of Lakota men, women, and children arrived at Wounded Knee Creek on the evening of December 28, 1890. Cold, exhausted, and under armed escort. Major Whitside, though carrying out orders to intercept and disarm them, treated the group with a measure of consideration rare for the circumstances. He provided tents for the freezing families and even arranged for a military doctor to examine Spotted Elk, whose pneumonia had worsened considerably over the course of the journey. For one night, at least, there was a fragile calm. That calm would not last. Overnight, the rest of the 7th Cavalry Regiment arrived to reinforce Whitside's detachment, bringing the total number of soldiers at the encampment to roughly 470 to 500 men. Commanding this larger force was Colonel James Forsyth, who took over authority at Wounded Knee upon his arrival. Against him and his men stood roughly 120 Lakota men capable of bearing arms, vastly outnumbered, surrounded on nearly every side, and further overshadowed by a devastating addition to the Army's position: 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns, rapid-firing, breech-loading artillery pieces capable of sending explosive shells into the camp from the high ground above, now positioned on the rising ground above the Lakota camp, aimed directly down into the tents below. By the morning of December 29, 1890, the encampment at Wounded Knee Creek looked less like a temporary resting place and more like a trap that had already closed. Colonel Forsyth's orders were clear. The Lakota were to be disarmed completely before being escorted onward to Pine Ridge. Soldiers moved through the camp that morning, gathering the Lakota men into a central area and beginning the process of collecting weapons, rifles, knives, even tools that might conceivably be used as weapons. Understandably, the Lakota men were reluctant to hand over the very items that represented their only means of hunting, protection, and self-sufficiency. Many had already survived one act of violence just 2 weeks earlier in the death of Sitting Bull. Now, surrounded by soldiers and cannon, they were being asked to give up the last means they had of defending themselves or their families. Among those present that morning was a spiritual figure of the group, a man performing elements of the ghost dance, even as the search proceeded, praying, some accounts suggest, for the protection promised by Wovoka's teachings. Tension in the camp rose with every passing minute. Soldiers searched tents. Weapons were pulled from bedding and clothing. The atmosphere grew thick with the kind of silence that exists only in the moments before something terrible happens, when everyone present can sense danger in the air, but no one can say exactly where it will come from. Then, in the middle of the search, a struggle broke out. Accounts differ on the precise details, some suggesting a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote may have refused to surrender his rifle, either because he had not understood the order or because the weapon represented something he was unwilling to part with. In the scuffle that followed, a shot was fired. To this day, no one can say with absolute certainty who fired first or whether the shot was accidental or deliberate. What is certain is what happened in the seconds after it rang out across the creek. The soldiers, already tense and surrounded by armed but vastly outnumbered Lakota men, responded with overwhelming force. Rifle fire erupted at close range within the crowded camp, and then From the high ground above, the Hotchkiss guns began to fire, their rapid shells tearing through the tents, the wagons, and the people sheltering among them, firing into a crowded camp where soldiers, men, women, and children were all caught in the same field of fire. Men, women, and children who had gathered that morning hoping only to be escorted safely to Pine Ridge now found themselves caught in a storm of gunfire from which there was almost nowhere to run. Some fled toward a nearby ravine, seeking whatever cover the landscape could offer. Soldiers pursued them, the shooting continuing across the surrounding hills and gullies for what accounts describe as nearly 2 miles from the original camp. By the time the guns finally fell silent, the snow-covered ground of Wounded Knee Creek was marked by the dead and wounded, and the promise of the ghost dance, the vision of restoration that had carried so many through months of desperation, seemed to lie broken in the frozen grass alongside the dead. When the gunfire at last fell silent on the afternoon of December 29th, 1890, the scene left behind at Wounded Knee Creek was one of almost unbearable devastation. Most historians place the number of Lakota dead somewhere between 250 and 300, although the exact total remains uncertain, with dozens more wounded. Among them, women and children who would later die of their injuries in the days that followed. On the Army side, 25 soldiers were killed and 39 wounded, a number of casualties that some historians believe may have resulted, at least in part, from the chaotic crossfire of the Hotchkiss guns themselves, fired down into a crowded and confused battlefield rather than at a clearly defined enemy line. In the hours after the shooting stopped, a brutal winter storm swept across the plains, burying the battlefield beneath heavy snow for 3 long days. Soldiers were unable to properly attend to the dead until the blizzard finally passed. When they returned, they found the bodies of the fallen frozen into the postures in which they had died, scattered across the snow in a scene that stayed with many witnesses for the rest of their lives. The Army gathered the frozen remains of the Lakota dead and buried them together in a single mass grave dug into the frozen earth near the creek. A hurried and impersonal end for so many lives lost. Photographs taken in the aftermath, preserved to this day in National Archives, remain some of the most haunting images in American history. Silent testimony to a tragedy that unfolded on a morning that had begun, for many of those present, with nothing more than the hope of reaching safety. In the immediate aftermath, the official narrative described the events at Wounded Knee as a battle, a framing that allowed the military to treat the engagement as a legitimate action, rather than what many historians and Lakota descendants have since described as a massacre of a largely disarmed and surrounded people. In a decision that remains deeply controversial to this day, 19 soldiers who took part in the events at Wounded Knee were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. In the decades since, numerous historians, tribal leaders, and members of Congress have called for those medals to be revoked, arguing that no honor should be attached to the deaths of so many unarmed civilians. As of this recording, none of those medals has been formally rescinded. In 2025, the Department of Defense announced that the awards would remain in place, a decision condemned by Native American leaders and advocates. For the Lakota people, the massacre at Wounded Knee marked something far larger than the loss of that single terrible day. It represented the symbolic end of the major era of organized Lakota resistance against the expansion of the United States across the Great Plains. A closing chapter in a struggle that had lasted for generations. The ghost dance movement, which had offered so much hope in its final months, faded in the years that followed, its promise of restoration unable to survive the reality of what had happened beneath the guns above Wounded Knee Creek. Yet the story of Wounded Knee did not end in 1890. Its memory endured, passed down through generations of Lakota families, a wound that time alone could not heal. More than 80 years later, in the year 1973, the same small piece of land became the site of another confrontation, when members of the American Indian movement, along with residents of the Pine Ridge Reservation, occupied the town of Wounded Knee for 71 days. Their protest drew national attention to the ongoing struggles faced by Native American communities and to the long, unresolved history of broken promises that had led, ultimately, back to this same quiet stretch of South Dakota prairie. Today, Wounded Knee stands as a designated National Historic Landmark, a place of solemn remembrance rather than celebration. Visitors who travel there find a simple monument, a small cemetery, and a landscape that, on a quiet day, gives little outward sign of the violence it once witnessed. But for the descendants of those who died there, and for the Lakota Nation as a whole, Wounded Knee remains something far more than a historical site. It remains a place of mourning, a place of memory, and a lasting reminder of a history that deserves to be told with honesty, with care, and with the respect owed to those who lost their lives on that frozen morning so long ago. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If it moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more real history, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Ring the bell so you never miss the next story. And if you know someone who'd appreciate this history, please share it with them.